Welcome, Maryam, to Kitchen Counter Conversations. I thought it'd be really nice to chat to you, seeing as we're worlds apart at the moment, but we both connect with food.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Numra. It's great to connect with you again. Yes, in the pre-COVID era, we had met. It was amazing. It was great to connect with you in Phnom Penh in person, shortly after actually we first spoke. And the reason we got connected is that I run a blog called Pakistan Eats. I'm also a freelance food writer, and I had started this series about spotlighting people doing innovative things with Pakistani foods. And by innovative, I just mean just sort of like being very thoughtful about the intersection of Pakistani food and culture. And so I remember, just really enjoying our conversation over the phone and then having the pleasure to meet you in person. I think just a few months afterwards.
Yeah, it was quite nice. I mean, for me, you're in Cambodia and Phnom Penh, as you've said, and for me, like I had chosen that sort of residency in Cambodia. Purely, my intention was like, oh, I want to experience new food. I want to travel in a new place. So it was so nice to meet you, and then to go to, you took me out for a local restaurant and stuff as well. So I think it was a nice sort of introduction to this, and the way we connect with food is through just experiencing something new. On this occasion, I thought it was really nice that, again, I mean, the June issue is about the holiday season, and there's raw food kind of plays on when we go traveling. And I think particularly in a Desi context, at least for me, my mum would pack the most strangest sandwiches, tuna fish sandwiches on a warm summer's day. At room temperature is not the one. But I thought it'd be fun if we both did a recipe swap and tried each other's dishes. So you shared your Chapli Kabab recipe.
And it was interesting when we decided to do the recipe swap. Like you said, like both of our recipes are similar in the sense they both relate to ground beef and and like sort of flatbread. But with Chapli Kabab, it's when we were talking, I don't know, it's just something that because I guess like everybody in the world right now, it's been a while since I've been to Pakistan, especially Pakistan's northern areas. And, I was just sort of feeling nostalgic at the moment. And I was thinking back to Swat, where we would go pretty much every year when we were kids, but it's probably been over a decade since I last went. But one of the very vivid memories I have of Chapli Kabab is just being out on the roadside, and there was this one guy who would just make Chapli Kababs. He would wrap them up in this really beautiful thick naan, and we would just be wolfing it down while standing. And normally I'm somebody who loves to sit down and enjoy a leisurely meal, but in that case it was just like a burst of amazing warm flavors on a very cool climate. And so when you brought up the idea of the sort of food and travel, I couldn't help but sort of revert back to that memory. And so this recipe was, because again, it's I normally make just normal kebabs, but then I was just thinking back to those days, and I thought I'd give it a try and just, learn to start making it at home.
We do have an array of, like you're saying, ground beef kebabs, whether it be seekh kebabs and, different variations. What makes Chapli Kabab that, it immediately when you taste it? Where is the magic in that?
The magic, I think that the one key ingredients that I think sets Chapli Kabab from other ground beef kebab is anardanna, which is dried pomegranate seed. And I think that is probably the primary differentiator for me, and sort of what gives it that little additional layer of flavor. Another thing with Chapli Kabab is it's also definitely a roadside food. It's something that it's one of those really popular frontier food that's made it across Pakistan because it's really easy to prepare, much more than say Shami kebab, which is a very laborious type of kebab that we normally have at home. But with Chapli Kabab, it's pretty quick, it's easy to prepare, and so that's why it's quite popular. The other, I think, distinguishing factor, although not as specific as anardanna, is the use of tomatoes in it. So nearly all the Chapli Kababs I've ever had will have incorporate tomatoes in it. But under that, of course, with all dishes, recipes everywhere. There'll be slight variations in the type of exact spices that you use, whether to use corn flour or not to use corn flour. So there's a bit of variation in that. But I feel like the use of tomatoes and anardanna are specifically what is the one consistency. And they're nearly always made with beef. I haven't seen any other type of meat that's used in chapli kebab.
I mean, the ground beef, like we're saying, it is, I think, across the world, it's such a popular patty, I suppose. I mean, even the burger itself. And I think that lends to the fact that obviously it's ground beef, so it's easier, it cooks a lot faster, and so it's quite a tender sort of patty as opposed to a whole chunk of beef. And then of course you can use any cut, so long as you have like a low, there's not too fatty, you know, it's always like mystery meat is combined into them if you're eating it at the wrong spot. So I think that's where certainly the ground beef patties do kind of lend themselves to being popular food. Myself, like, I always find I know I'm eating a chapli kebab when I bite into a coriander seed. I'm just like, oh yeah, that's such a distinct thing. But you're right, the anardanna definitely adds a certain, I would describe, it's a really interesting, it's kind of like sumac, isn't it? It has a citrusy note, but not quite. It's been like, for me at the moment, I've been exploring that as it's a seed, but it's a spice, as a spice and as a seasoning, and it lends itself so delicately to a lot of flavoring with food, and I think that really adds to it. When I was cooking your recipe, I was actually with my parents and I was preparing a barbecue, and I had my mum constantly on my shoulder being like, this is not how we make it, what are you doing with that? And I'm not just like, I'm following someone else's recipe. It's like, and then she'd just be like, no, you have to put corn flour in it. And then there was 2 points in which she was like, you have to, she's like, what are you doing? And I mean, it wasn't anything sacrilege. It was literally, I was just like toasting the anardanna. She goes, you don't need to do that. And I'm just like, look, I'm doing someone else's. And then it was also, what was I doing? With the onions, I started dicing them. She goes, why are you wasting your time dicing the onions? And then she's like, just grate the onions and squeeze out the water. And then, and I was just like, oh, actually, that's made it easier. And then, and one final one with the tomato. She's like, you're not going to blanch the tomato to take the skin off? And I'm just like, no, it's not in her recipe. And then she was literally like, you have to blanch. And it was so funny for my mum, and we don't have any heritage from the northern areas. It's not like a family recipe, but for her it was like, this has to be done a certain way. And it was just like, she was just like itching. She's like, why is she putting corn flour in it? But at the end it was funny, like, of all the things we made, we had lamb chops, we had chicken tikka and everything. It was like, oh my God, the chapli kababs are the ones which are like, everyone was like, they're the most flavoursome. They're like, oh, that's definitely the winner on the dinner table today. And I think it was really lovely. For me, as I'm cooking, and in my mind, I'm like, Mom, there's not much difference to what you're saying and what this recipe is, but for some reason she's like so insistent, like, you can't make it any other way. And I find that thinking really always quite amusing, that the idea of something being authentic in that way. And it certainly was. I was saying that to my sister, that I was like, everyone was like, oh, I had 2 chapli kababs, and normally we'll have like one of everything, and it was like, oh my God, they're so delicious and they're so tender, I think, and it's the adding of the tomatoes, they're so soft to eat. But I was like, it's also interesting that we were so smitten by them at the final meal, was because it was something that we've had so many times, but your way of doing it brought a different side to something familiar.
Is that something that you would also have at home? Because for us, it was always restaurant food. And so we would never cook it at home. It was just that was one of the reasons I figured I should just teach myself, because clearly, I mean, I move overseas a lot, so I don't always have access. A chapli kebab is one of those things that you'll never find in the menu when you're traveling overseas, outside of maybe UK or places with huge Pakistani communities.
Yeah, that's an even amusing thing. Like, we don't make it on a regular basis. It wouldn't be on our dinner table. Perhaps someone was being, in their mind, slightly different and adventurous on the day, and they would make a chapli kebab, but it's definitely not part of our like family repertoire of like recipes. And like, it is a certain thing that if we would go to, for instance, we would go to eat somewhere which has like tandoor tikka and kebab and stuff, it may be one of the things like, okay, let's also have a chapli kebab instead of the seekh kebabs. And there would always be that sort of contentious feeling like someone wanted the seekh kebabs. What have you done?
Yeah, you never know. There has to be a ground beef kebab on the barbecue table. flavor, shape, and variety that I always talk about. Like that, they're kind of like a true staple.
It lends itself in so many ways, and it just adds Pakistanis, I think, having a sort of penchant to having loads of meat. It was like, even we had 4 different cuts of meat, and I was like, this is really intense. But it's a part of the barbecue flair. But it's, I mean, so how did you come about developing this recipe? Where did you find it?
So the recipe is an adaptation from maybe 2 to 3 recipes. So Samin Rushdi's Indian cookery was like sort of my base. And I remember like when we were talking about it, it's also about how recipes can be a template, right? And it's something that as a recipe developer for the last several years, I do find it amusing because much like your mom, my relatives or a lot of the previous generation that I talk to, they'll have a lot of opinions that there's only one way. But when you actually start developing recipes and you sort of look cross-reference, you're like, wow, there's actually dozens and dozens of variations, and each family brings their own sort of take on it, and each cook brings their own preference to it as well. So with this, I use Samin Rushdi's Indian cookery. And if you haven't, I mean, I think people who are watching it, if you don't own a copy and are interested in North Indian or Pakistani food, it's definitely like, it's a great cookbook. I looked at that, and I looked at Samin Nusrat's New York Times Chapli Kabab recipe. Interestingly, that was also a travel-inspired recipe for her, because Samin Nusrat traveled to Pakistan, and again, she has this memory of eating Chapli Kababs in the northern area. Mm-hmm. So it's very similar. So I kind of like cross-referenced those, tested them out, and then try to sort of incorporate more flavors to make them feel more familiar to me. So that's kind of how I developed the recipe. So it was developed in Cambodia.
My starting point always with my recipes is always talking to my mum about it, and then I'll kind of expand out, and then she'll give me a framework. It's so interesting they're saying that about recipe developing. She kind of gives me this framework, and she'll always usually have a version of it somewhere in her mind. Like, it's never written anywhere. It's so much part of our oral tradition. And then I work my way back going to recipe books, and I have a lovely book actually over here, funnily enough, but it's called Cuisine Along the Grand Trunk Road. And this is something, I mean, I'll share all the books that we reference, but it's so charming. And it's a lovely recipe book, but it's also creates a good sort of visual understanding of how these dishes all connect, and how the spices connect, and how they travel to different regions. And I think it kind of creates a sort of landscape on the literal sense of where food is coming from. And Chapli Kabab, certainly, as you're adding the spices and the ingredients, you're like, where did the pomegranates come from and they were dried from? Where did this, the coriander, where was that grown? And you get that sense of geography when you're making something like that. My recipe actually was it's funny. It has nothing to do with Pakistan. It's truly being a British Pakistani, being on the beach, where we were dying to have some fish and chips and dying to have an ice cream cone. But my khalas and my mum sitting on Brighton Beach on the pebbles would bring out. It wasn't even Maryam, it wasn't even like a picnic basket or a thermal container. It would be like a naan ka hot pot, Or like a patili would come out, and we'd be like, oh my God. And then these foiled rolled parathas would come out with the keema, and it would just be passed around, and we all would be like, what are we eating on the beach? I don't want to eat this. But then within minutes, all of us would just be silent for about a good 10 minutes, and we'd all be wolfing.
I mean, whatever it is, it's tasty. Doesn't look sexy. It's not. But you know what? It tastes good.
Exactly. But then it hits the spot. Like, I mean, Brighton Beach isn't exactly like a holiday tropical destination. It was like a cold beach, and the wind would be blowing, and we'd all somehow be wet from this cold water. But then it hit the spot in a way that I think nothing else would have. And I think it really connected us as a family to be making it, and again, it was like aloo keema. Like, we'd have it's like ground beef with like, it would either be with potatoes or peas, and in a homemade paratha as well, there'd be something that we're like, oh yeah, it's wholesome, we'd eat it. There's so much flavor, and it kind of brought us the whole family together and we'll just be like twisting around the foil and working our way down.
For me, aloo keema, growing up, you always have it at home. It's one of those very quintessential Pakistani home cooking. And when you linked it to travel, I was like, and the fact that it's picnic food in a way, and I was like, yes, because I mean, definitely parathas for us was a go-to. And then pulao was like another one that would transport really easily. And so, yeah, like, so it is very like domestic holiday, family gets together. But yeah, I really enjoyed making your recipe. But again, it was one of those things where it's a dish that ties so many households together, but there's so many variations in the sequencing and the spices, exact spices that were used, that I was like, oh, that's like very interesting. Like she adds tomatoes towards the end versus like, because normally the way I would sequence it is I would, soften the onions, add the spices, then the tomatoes and the meat. So just things like that, which make the sequencing really different, but also interesting. And it lends it like its own like Numra and household flavor to keema, which is like, yes, it's a dish I'm familiar with, but it's a little bit different and in a good way.
There's all these different ways, like even adding the tomatoes at different stages. Again, I've heard other people being like, no, add them right after the onions. So when you add the spices, you don't burn the spices. But this again, and I'm like, no, but you can, sometimes I would add a splash of water and it's just, so you don't burn the spices. So there's enough moisture in the pan. Right. But even the adding of whole spices with the keema, and then again, different, like I've had be like, why don't you just put a teaspoon of garam masala? And I'm like, the whole spices in this keema kind of add something else to it, and you're not supposed to but eat them. Like, having ground spices running through it, bring another flavor. Whereas using the whole cinnamon bark and all of them, like, which you then can selectively, I mean, if you have the misfortune of biting a peppercorn or a clove, that's on you. But suddenly picking them out, I think that it kind of infuses the meat with its own sort of thing. I mean, there would be, I always have one khala who would take it an extra level and would also smoke it and add dhanai to it. So she'd add a piece of coal at the end, and so the meat would have a smoky sort of finish to it, which would also be quite nice. I know you
also the aromatics of it too, of using whole spices, right? I think it's part of it with garam masala. I mean, I love ground garam masala, and I've always been a huge proponent of just using ground spices. But at the same time, like my favorite keema recipes always use whole spices, just because it's the flavor, but it's also the aromatics, and which are such a huge component of South Asian food as well. And a lot of the use of black cardamom, for example, I don't think black cardamom itself is used, or bay leaves infuse a ton of their own flavor, but it's mostly just, like kind of, it softens the smell of like the very rich smell of ground meat. And so there's also that. But yeah, I think again, you and I've grown up with whole spices, but I know my spouse hasn't. So for him, it's always like a bit like, oh, there's a clove. It's like, there's another line mine over there. And so I think over the years of like 12 years of being together, he's gotten used to the fact that, hey, you know what, you're going to run into it and it's okay. It's part of the experience.
I mean, for me, when I eat in restaurants, Pakistani restaurants or Desi restaurants, it's a sign of authenticity. So if I'm eating a biryani and I'm like, oh, okay, there's loads of whole spices, I know it's going to be a good one. Or so that's certainly where it's, if I can't see it, I'm like, no, take it back. Like, I need to have the whole spices. You haven't made this properly.
Right.
I kind of see it. It's like, the way you garnish something. The garnish should signify what's already in the dish. And so you understand the sort of layers. But even seeing the whole spices in a dish, I think that kind of lends to like what spices they add certain like flavor sort of level. And as you're talking about the aromatics and everything, but it also lends to the visual experience of like, oh, okay, these are the spices that have gone into this dish. And because you don't pick them out, it's not like you have put a bouquet ghani in and then you take them out later. They're very much, and the intention is to pick them out and eat around the
spices, right? I actually just did recently, it was a couple of days ago, that I made Nick Sharma's from his book Season. He had like a interesting take on pulao where he incorporated the use of eggplant. So that was his own creative take. It was actually it's a lovely pulao. But I mean, again, it was nice for him to include in the recipe note that, listen, if you want, you can just, take the whole spices out with a discarded spoon, because, it used the usual black cardamom, cloves, peppercorns, but he's like, I prefer to leave them in. Yeah. And I think it's just kind of one of those that if you don't like to just sort of stumble through them, you can, but just the way we've sort of grown up eating it and sort of kind of in that, I agree. I never take them out. Only if I have like an especially like maybe picky guest, I might go through the extra step, but normally I just leave them in. Yeah.
I also like what you're saying actually about black cardamom and bay leaves. I actually have not, I don't know how, I'm like, how much does that say about the food I'm cooking? I haven't experienced using black cardamom in other cuisines before, but bay leaf, obviously it runs through a lot of Italian food and things, but it's certainly the sort of way it, I sometimes there's a part of me and I'm like, why am I putting a bay leaf in this? But it is what it does. It kind of, it almost, it kind of, sort of softens the blow of the meat, the smell of the meat and the other spices. And it's about balance. Like it doesn't add so much as it detracts from things to even the flavors out. Don't you think?
Absolutely. And I think so. And it's funny. And it's also one of those things where you kind of have to, when you do cooking classes or you're sort of sharing a recipe, a traditional recipe with somebody who's from outside of like South Asian culture, and they're all like, but like, where do I find? And they're stressing over the fact that they can't find black cardamom overseas. And I kind of have to sort of explain that, it's okay if you don't use black cardamom. I'm like, yes, traditionally that's the way we make it, but it's not going to completely take away from the flavor, but it's for other reasons. So it's always sort of an interesting balance. Whereas I always have black cardamom in the pantry, but at the same time, if you don't have it, it's okay, Yeah. You're like, you can still go ahead and proceed with sort of making the recipe, and it's not gonna drastically change the flavor of the dish. But again, it's about a little bit of balance. It's about the aromatics, and it's sort of like the tradition we've grown with. But again, it's also like using recipes as templates. And again, since I moved from locations where the variants, and Phnom Penh, we were actually very lucky because it's an international city. So I've been actually never been short of any spices. But while I was living in Juarez, Mexico, it's on the border. It's already, even in terms of Mexico, it's a pretty barren landscape. So we wouldn't get a lot of produce, forget about like a big variety of spices. And so like a lot of my recipes that I was developing were quite pared down based on what was available. And I never let that sort of prevent me from trying cooking Pakistani food, like just stopping me. So I think this is also for those who don't let the sheer volume of spices discourage you from cooking something.
It's absolutely magic actually living in London, where there's so many Desi wholesalers and grocers around. And when I say wholesalers, I mean obviously like there's just regular households who are buying a sack of rice and flour. So they're for the domestic person. But certainly we just have so many shops in the area. And I'm fascinated when people are like, I couldn't find this ingredient and that ingredient. And I'm like, you need to go around the corner in Brixton Market or in Tooting or in Tottenham, you see them. And there's just like the variety of lentils and spices you can get. And they become staples. And I think I'm very lucky that way that we have such a large South Asian community in the city. And I think
the use of like, for example, fresh methi is like such a big part of like so many dishes, particularly Sindhi food. And it's really, really difficult for me to recreate those recipes because dried methi and fresh methi is so different.
Exactly.
And so it's something that I sort of go back and forth about. Like, I'm all for adaptation in terms of like, using what you have and if you can find dry. But like with methi is one of those things that I was like, I wish I lived in a country where I could just easily get access to fresh methi, but it's just something that I haven't been able to find.
Yes. There's certain dishes which, again, I'll be going through my family recipes and I'm doing the very controversial thing where I'm amending that. And I can certainly see, I was like, whether it's coming from my mum or my aunts or my grandmother, I'm like, I can see how heavy-handed she's become with something like methi because she's using a dry one. So in her mind, I can sense that she's like, oh, I need to add more because it's a dry, I'm using the dry version. I don't have access to the fresh one. But it's bringing a different, I think at times like the flavor is so much stronger. But it's the way like an amateur cook at home is like, oh no, I'll put more in. And I'm like, no, you need to put less in. Like,
Absolutely right. Because dried methi is so strong, and it was exactly the same. I was trying a classic Sindhi recipe, and I did exactly what your grandmother did, which was like, I put in I didn't put in more, but I put in the exact same amount of dried methi as was fresh methi, and it was still tasty, but it's such a strong flavor in its dried form that it definitely altered the taste of the dish. And I was like, oh, it's flavorful and tasty, but I was like, I don't think that that's what was intended.
It's almost like you need to half it, really. Yeah, I mean, and having methi in the house as well, it's like you open the jar and it's like the whole house is smelling and you know exactly what's being made. But yeah, I know, and I mean, on the final thing, like, what did you serve your keema with? I know we both struggle with our flatbreads.
I have a confession to make. I did use a store-bought paratha.
Yeah. During Ramzan, people share so many recipes for parathas, and I'm like, I as unhealthy as the store-bought ones are, just as unhealthy as a home paratha is, you know, layered with so much ghee. But it's such a labor of love, and I'm like, no way in hell am I. No, I mean, hell is not the right turn of phrase to use for Ramzan. But like, no way am I going to be making a paratha like just before dawn. I want to be making something, you know. And I was like, actually find the joy in other elements of the dishes when you're during that month, and like add an element of convenience in to bring flavor into something a lot simpler. And yeah, it's like the idea of making a fresh paratha at Fajr, like, you know, just it doesn't make sense to me. I think I want to have it on a day where I'm not feeling hungry either, because I want to spend the time like preparing it.
But it is a true labor of love. Like, again, it's one of those things, I can't do it on an empty stomach. I want to know I have the time to mess up. But of course, I'm hoping with, you know, persistence and years of practice, I'll get there. Well, maybe, who knows, I will be making parathas at the crack of dawn. But just not there yet. Yeah.
No. I mean, I don't think that's happening in my lifetime, but someone else can make them for me. But I do think, I mean, the things we underestimate, like we think like making rotiyan and making a good cup of chai as well, like they're an essential life skill. But saying that, I also feel there's an art to it, and there isn't that sort of like skill in everyone's hand, and it's something that you need to develop through practice. And I think obviously like it's become a life skill, because people who have to make roti are not just making, you don't just make one or two, you are probably making, but you know, on every day, on a daily basis, you're making up to 20. So you get, you know, you become a bit of a craftsman, and you know, a karigar of sorts making rotiyan. But I think there's a real art to making it, and I think that shouldn't be denied. Like, we have to respect that, as opposed to thinking.
Yeah, and especially because I grew up in Pakistan, I took it so for granted, just because. And my mom, again, she makes roti, and like my mother-in-law, the same. The way they just sort of like they can do it with their eyes closed, and they can make, like my mother-in-law, she makes like the Bengali versions are luchis, which are a little bit smaller, but she'll like make like 10 at a time, and it's just without breaking a sweat. And you know, again, it is crowd, so it's a pleasure just, you know, looking at her and watching her do her thing. Because but yeah, again, it's you're right that there is like a special talent, I feel. My mom is one of 8, and I remember she was like, I was the one who was designated to make the roti. She was like, out of the sisters, she was the one who had it in her hands to be able to make the best roti. So it's nice. That is definitely, like, I definitely do think it's part talent.
I mean, there's an unconscious, whenever I've made them, I think the ones which are good are the fluke. And the bad ones are an expression of my experience and understanding. But just I don't even think people are thinking of it consciously. It's just the movement of when you're kind of rolling it out, the movement of the dough, and you know, knowing exactly when to flip it, knowing exactly. I get really impatient and I want to see how it's going. And my mom's like, it's just a matter of seconds. But she's like, just don't touch it for a good like 3 seconds, and then do some movement and spinning it. And it is all part of that instinct that you develop as you make more and more. So it's, you know, I kind of have to, I think, you know, have to remind people, and we shouldn't assume. But I think growing up in Britain and being South Asian, I think the greatest reference has been Betting It Like Beckham. And they have the very much having parathe roll on the beach and having the mum being like, who will marry you if you don't have round rotis? And it's like, no one will marry us, and it's fine. No one will marry us on the basis of our roti. So it's all part of that narrative. But yeah, it's been a pleasure chatting to you, Maryam. And
Thank you so much for having me. This was super fun. It was great to see you again.
can you tell us where can people find your recipes and what your Instagram handle is?
You can find my recipes on pakistanaeats.com, and my Instagram handle is the same. So it's Pakistan Eats. So yeah, I'm looking forward to staying connected to you guys. And yeah, thanks for tuning in.
And I'll be sharing all the links for the books that we just both referenced in the description. It'll be on YouTube, but it's going to be available on my website and stuff as well. And I'll be sharing a version of it on Instagram.
Take care. Bye.